My name is Alan Walker. Since retiring in 2010, I have joined a number of creation science organizations like Creation Research Society, Logos Research Associates, and the Twin Cities Creation Science Association, which I serve as secretary and help bring in well-known creation scientists and teachers like David Coppedge. I will now be interviewing David Coppedge on his experiences and viewpoints on the Cassini mission to Saturn and its moons. Now, David is a gifted creation science writer and also involved in the development and production of video documentaries on intelligent design and biblical apologetics. David is on the board of Illustria Media with Lad Allen that makes these documentaries. David, on a personal note, I have purchased 150 copies of Call of the Cosmos and given them out to so many families. I just love that video. And it's a great compliment to the 3 DVD set from Spike Sparris, which he has on the solar system, galaxies, and the universe. Now, since late 2000, David has maintained the Creation Evolution Headlines website. Our audience on this podcast can check that out at crev.info, crev.info. This website covers many scientific disciplines, and David works very closely with Dr. Jerry Bergman on the information on that site and others. David wrote a book in 2017 with Dr. Henry Richter, a pioneer in aerospace. The book's entitled Spacecraft Earth, a Guide for Passengers. Now, back to the Cassini mission. David worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and for most of his 14 years was team lead system administrator, responsible for 15 networks and 200 plus computers in America and Europe. David, is there anything that you would like to add to your bio?
Well, I think you have a pretty extensive CV yourself, Alan, with many years of experience in plant breeding and agronomy. So my only PhD is post-hole digging, but but I'm glad to join you today.
Well, thank you, David. On October 20th, 2020, about a month ago from the day we're recording this, David gave a talk on the Cassini legacy on Saturn. And he gave that talk to the Twin Cities Creation Science Association. That video of the presentation has been uploaded at the TCCSA YouTube, and it was uploaded around the beginning of November 2020. And this video shows many laboratory and space images, and David shared on some of the major discoveries on the Saturn system, the planet itself, its rings, its many moons, and its magnetic field. David, there are two subjects that I would like you to briefly cover in this podcast. Number one, the evidence in the solar system that goes against deep time. And number two, the design of the Earth, moon, and planets in our solar system to allow for life on planet Earth. So please start us out with the Cassini mission and what had the greatest impact on you that our solar system is not as old as we've been taught.
Well, the Saturn system is filled with evidence for youth. You know, it's interesting that Gustav Holst in his famous tone poem, The Planets, called Saturn the bringer of old age. But I think we need to revise that in retrospect, looking at all the evidence that Cassini gathered. And one of the most interesting, I think, is Titan, the large moon of Saturn, which is in diameter, it's about the width of the United States. That gives you an idea. It's the second largest moon in the solar system, and it's even bigger than the planet Mercury. And all of the scientists since the Voyager days predicted that it would have a global ocean of liquid ethane that could be anywhere from half a kilometer to miles deep. And the reason they thought that was because there's methane in Titan's atmosphere. And 20% of the time in its 30-year orbit, Titan is outside of Saturn's protective magnetic field, so it gets hit by the solar wind. And so the solar wind hits the methane molecules in the atmosphere and reduces them to ions. It splits them in half, and then those halves recombine into ethane, which has 2 carbons instead of 1, which methane has. So it's C2H6. Now, ethane at those temperatures is a liquid, and it has nowhere to go but down to the surface. And so if you extrapolate out for 4.5 billion years of this process, there should be so much ethane down there that it should just pile up and create a huge ocean around the whole thing. Well, I predicted when the Huygens probe dropped down in January 2005 that there would be very little ethane found because you can't see the surface from orbit. There's too much haze and smog in the atmosphere. So the Huygens probe, which is like a flying saucer, dropped down to the surface and found very little. They found some vapor of methane that they could sniff with the instruments, but there was no global ocean. And so I think that was a good prediction of a young Saturn system.
Can I interrupt and ask you, in your prediction, were there other colleagues at Jet Propulsion Laboratory that agreed with you at the time?
It was a silent prediction, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Because, I was not working as a scientist. I was a computer geek, I guess you could say,
Right.
team lead system administrator. But I remember writing that at Creation Evolution Headlines at the time that I didn't think there would be much. And sure enough, there was not. Now, that's just one evidence on one of the moons, but there's other moons and other evidences on Titan and Saturn itself. So do you have any in particular you'd like to hear about?
No, why don't you give another example?
Okay, well, Enceladus is a tremendous discovery. Back in the Voyager days, they realized that this was the brightest object, the brightest moon in the solar system. And so they wondered if it was being coated with ice somehow, maybe by ice volcanoes or ice geysers or something. So they were very interested to return to Enceladus because we couldn't tell from the Voyager images back in 1981. So when we had several flybys of Enceladus planned. Enceladus is about the width of Iowa or Arizona. Okay, so it's just 300 miles wide, a small moon as moons go. But it also sits in the densest part of a faint ring of Saturn called the E ring. And so they were very interested to see if anything is happening on the surface. And it took a few months of explorations, but we finally flew close enough to see that there indeed were geysers erupting out of the South Pole of all places of this moon, only on the South Pole. There's these parallel cracks, about 4 of them, that they were dubbed tiger stripes because they were parallel cracks right on the South Pole. And out of those cracks, ice particles of water ice were shooting out at very high speed, over the speed of sound. And some of that would fall back on Enceladus, and some of it went out into space and created the E-ring itself. So here's this little 300-mile wide moon, and it's creating a vast ring of material around Saturn. And
That's
so
amazing.
that was a big surprise. So you got to ask yourself, how long has that been going on? If that had been going on for 4.5 billion years, then you would that poor little moon would have turned itself inside out multiple times, or just shrunken away. So it's an amazing evidence for youth. And I want to say just something about evidence for youth in the solar system. We cannot take data and calculate a precise age of things because you have to make assumptions about how long it's been going on and when it started, and there's things that we cannot observe. Now, old earthers like to set lower limits where they can say, well, this thing can't be any younger than 10,000 years or 10 million years or 100 million years. But that requires making a lot of assumptions. So I say like the observation to assumption ratio is very low. It's kind of like signal to noise ratio. You want to have a high signal to noise ratio rather than noise. So the observation to assumption ratio in old earthers is very low, but you can take instead an upper limit by taking the observations you have and then maybe extrapolating them out a safe amount. So if we claim that there's an upper limit on something, we're not saying that it fits a biblical chronology exactly, but it can't be older than a lot of the old earthers assume. Now, the secular scientists in Cassini and the experts on rings and moons and bodies like that, they have come up themselves with upper limits on the ages of some of these processes, like the ages of the rings, the ages of Titan's surface, and like we heard about the lack of a global ocean on Titan. But on Enceladus, you can't set a very long timeline for how long this little moon has been pumping out ice particles. In fact, there's so much energy coming out of the south pole of Enceladus is something like 2.3 times as much energy as in all of Yellowstone's geysers and hot springs combined. So that's a lot of energy coming out of this moon. And they will say things like, well, maybe it's been going on for 10 million years or 100 million years max. But again, that's not a lower limit, that's an upper limit. And so it can't be longer than that. And the reason that's good for us in creation science is that if we even gave them that much time, like 10 million years, that's a tiny fraction of the time that they expect that those things have been going there. And it's not near enough time for Darwinian evolution, even if you accepted the premise that random mutations and natural selection could create humans out of bacteria. You know, there's
Right.
just, I mean, trillions, quadrillions of years wouldn't be enough for that. So they have, I have articles and publications from Nature and Science and other journals where the scientists admit that these things look young. They use the word young, youthful, frequently in phenomena at Saturn. And I think Enceladus is a great example.
Well, thank you for giving those two examples of two of the moons of Saturn that show that they don't complement deep time. The second question, David,
Okay.
is on the concept of the inhabitable zone in the Milky Way galaxy and in the solar system, and the probabilities that all of this could not have happened by chance, but by design. What are your thoughts there?
Well, in my book with Dr. Richter, Spacecraft Earth, we have a page or a section devoted to that. And it's not just one factor, but a dozen factors, perhaps more, that are required to be able to have a planet that can support life. Now, everybody knows pretty much about the habitable zone for the Earth, where you have to have it where it can support liquid water. If it's too close to the sun, it would evaporate. If it's too far from the sun, everything would freeze. So you have a narrow band called the continuously habitable zone where water can exist. But that's not the only thing that we need. We need the right chemical composition. We need to make sure that the orbit is not too elliptical, that its eccentricity is low. You have to make sure the obliquity, the angle of tilt, is not too high. You have to have a right rotation rate. And so you can look in the book and see us talk about a dozen different factors. And if you add up the improbability of any planet in having all those factors simultaneously, it becomes you could almost say that the Earth is unique in the universe in being suitable for life, at least complex life, and probably any life. And as far as the galaxy goes, you mentioned the galactic habitable zone. There's also a zone in the Milky Way galaxy where planets can exist. And this was discussed in The Privileged Planet by Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards, where there's a band in the galaxy, in the spiral galaxy, where inside of it would not be suitable for life and outside of it would not be suitable for life. So that narrows down the possibilities even further. And I'm of the opinion, I came to this slowly just by realizing that that I think the Earth may be the only habitable planet in the universe. Because when you run the numbers, it's too hard to find any body that could have everything just right. You have to have the right kind of star that is not sending out flares too much, and numerous things like that. So it sounds like a preposterous position to say that we're alone in the universe. And yet, if you look at the facts, and I'm not the only one saying it, there were two atheist scientists who wrote a book called Rare Earth, where they talked about these things. And there was another book recently called A Fortunate Universe, talking about some of these things. And the specifications that are required for life are very, very narrow. And when you run the numbers, do the math, you find out that it's almost like miraculous that the Earth exists.
I have a follow-up on that. I've been reading about exoplanets, and I think they've found some 4,000 of those. But when they start to look at all the parameters around those planets, they don't think any of them could support life. So that's more evidence of what you're saying.
Yes, the Kepler spacecraft, which was named by a great creation scientist, Johannes Kepler, discovered thousands of exoplanets. And so now we have quite a catalog of exoplanets, but most of them we know are not suitable for life. They're around the wrong kind of star that's too dangerous, has too much radiation. And to their great surprise, and here's a lesson on not building a theory out of an example of one. We knew about our solar system, but all of the other solar systems or exoplanet systems that we have found are very unlike ours. In other words, we have our gas giants way out in the peripheries, in the suburbs, and the rocky planets close. But they found a number of what they call hot Jupiters, which are giant gas planets that are closer to the star than Mercury is to the sun, which was a huge surprise. And so that's another evidence that our solar system is very unique and very special, because most of the exoplanet systems have their gas giants close in, and that would ruin the habitable zone for rocky planets.
I've read a verse in the Bible, I think it's in Isaiah, where God describes creating the earth for it to be inhabited. And obviously it has been inhabited by man in all types of life, which we can't seem to find elsewhere at this point in time.
Yes, I believe that's Isaiah 45:21, a great passage that he says, I am the Lord, and I have made it to be inhabited. So, God had an intelligent design in designing our planet to be just right for complex beings. There's a series of books by Dr. Michael Denton, who is not a creationist, but has written for the Discovery Institute, where he talks about the properties of light, the properties of water, and most recently in the Wonder of the Cell, I think is the recent book, where he talks about all of the atoms and their availability on the earth, and how there's just so many finely tuned coincidences about atoms and molecules, and about carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, these things that we take for granted, that if they were slightly different would rule out complex life at least, and probably any life.
Are there any closing things that you would like to share at this point in time?
Well, I would just like creationists to take courage in the fact that we have a tremendous amount of evidence for a young solar system and a young Earth. In fact, I have about 2 hours worth of PowerPoint slides showing from Mercury all the way out to Pluto, all of the evidences for a young Earth. And of course, you mentioned Spike Pisaras's videos, which are excellent on that point too. So if you understand this concept of an upper limit, that it's too low for evolution to take place, then you've got to start asking questions like, well, what's the alternative to 4.5 billion year solar system? And what's the alternative to Darwinism, which could never take place in a younger solar system? And then you work your way down a logical sequence of questions that I think points directly at the truth of the Bible and the life of Jesus Christ, our Messiah, his death and resurrection for our salvation. And so it's the way that the evidence points that gets us to our Lord Jesus Christ and our hope of heaven.
Well, I want to thank you very much, David Coppedge, for participating in this podcast, and encourage our listeners to look up Illustra Media and all the videos that they have on a whole host of subject matter around life and creation, the universe, and then also Creation Evolution Headlines website at crev.info. Thank you for sharing about scientific apologetics that's backed up by the Bible, about what our history is in the Bible. Thank you to our Creator, Lord Jesus Christ, that He gave mankind the intelligence that we could explore His created universe by telescope, and now beyond that, the solar system by manned spacecraft and unmanned spacecraft like the Cassini mission and the probe it sent out. So with that, we'll close, and thanks again, David.
My pleasure. Thank you.